Yep, thank you. So we carried out this market study this year. And what the study shows is that we're now at 86% of the palm oil imported for food, feed, and oleochemicals in EU to be sustainable. And that is a slight increase from the figure that we presented in this forum a year ago, when we were at 83%. But it also shows that progress is limited, that in a year we only had a small increase in the percentage that was available. And at the same time, so as we say, the import of sustainable palm oil into Europe is being more or less stagnant now, whereas we saw in the past quite a bit of a growth. And this is compared to a 5% increase of the total palm oil imports. If you look at the more detailed numbers, then you will see that actually there was a small decrease, very small decrease, on the total RSPO volume. However, an increase in the physical RSPO, but with the credit system, we see a decrease. So, of course, these are relatively small percentages, but they might go for the trends that we're going more and more for physical. If we then look at our challenge and the topic of today, which is 100% sustainable palm oil in Europe by 2020, then we see that over the years we've made great progress, but it's leveling off. We're fighting a threshold here. And yeah, what are our next steps? That's really also the discussion for today, right? I mean, how do we act upon the gaps that we see? Can we involve more governments? How can we involve other consumer markets? But also, how can we partner more with producing countries, governments, partners in those countries to close the gap? And that's also an important notion that you can see on this slide, where you see, today we present to you the latest figures from Europe, but Europe, of course, is not the largest market for palm oil at all. So how do we also get the other markets involved so that the whole sector starts transitioning? I think that is also really important, that today we take the discussion beyond Europe itself. And with that, I think this provides a good overview of where we are in Europe right now. And now I would like to ask Sabrina to present the work of WWF, which goes in a much more granular level into the trends in the European market and beyond. So Sabrina, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. Can I just check that the slides are up? I'm going to be presenting a few slides. Thank you. So I'll be talking to some of the findings of our palm oil buyers scorecard. But firstly, just as a couple of introductory remarks, first of all, it's never been more critical to work towards conversion-free, sustainable palm oil now that COVID-19 has really revealed again how connected human health is to planetary health. And secondly, as Dan mentioned as well in his introduction, we're talking here about closing the gap in Europe in this session, but this is a global challenge. Europe only represents 12% of global palm oil consumption, and the estimations, the 86% that we've got, are really not representative, of course, of the global picture. Only a fifth of total palm oil production on a global level is produced to the RSPO standard, and a large proportion of that enters Europe. So we have sustainable supply chains entering Europe, but at the same time, the same companies or their suppliers are involved with trading and using unsustainable palm oil in other geographies. So it's really important. I think the key message throughout the presentation as well, companies really need to be held accountable for their global supply chains, especially where they're active in markets that have higher consumption, and they really need to require all of their suppliers to take action across all of their operations as well. So now our palm oil buyers scorecard. So this has been published by WWF since 2009, and it really shows what our key asks of palm oil buyers are and how they're performing against them. So the latest edition of the scorecard, which you can see here on the slide, was published at the beginning of 2020, beginning of this year. And I'm going to speak to some of the findings today. So on the right, you can see we assessed this time 173 companies with headquarters in Europe, North America, Asia, Australia, but over 2/3 of these companies are headquartered in Europe. In total, about 3/4 of all companies contacted responded globally, and a little bit more in Europe, 80%. So what did we assess in this scorecard? What questions did we ask? So the methodology you can see now on the slide represents, again, our main asks of palm oil buyers, which have been agreed upon across the WWF network. So there are 22 potential points in total for a company that are divided into two main categories to cover both actions taken within the company's own supply chain, as well as to support sustainable palm oil beyond the company's supply chain. So you can see here in the first category, we have firstly, commitments to buying certified sustainable palm oil. Of course, this is the simplest action a company can take towards cleaning its own supply chain and incentivizing more sustainable production. Secondly, we also scored how much certified palm oil companies actually use for each type of palm oil, and our scoring rewards companies for shifting towards physical supplies of certified palm oil, identity preserved or segregated. Thirdly, we looked at the scope to which the quantities of certified palm oil relate, as multinational companies and groups have an obligation to ensure that they act upon their sustainability commitments wherever they use palm oil, as we mentioned, across all entities, all markets. And then the fourth and fifth items in this first category are about supplier requirements on the implementation of a no deforestation, no conversion commitment, and on traceability to the mill or the plantation. And then the second broad category, which is really important for us, and a lot of what we're going to be speaking about today, relates to actions taken beyond the company's own supply chain. So that covers two sub-items, one around membership of action-oriented sustainable palm oil platforms, and another one on on-the-ground investments in palm oil producing landscapes to support smallholders, protect and restore forests and other natural ecosystems, and support landscape and jurisdictional approaches. So now we know which questions we asked. What have we found in this year's scorecard? In short, we found that companies that use palm oil are falling short on their commitments to eliminate the environmental and social damage being caused by palm oil supply chains. Not a single company attained the top score, and most still have a long way to go. And that's after more than a decade of awareness and commitments. So it's not acceptable for any company using palm oil today to be moving too slowly or dodging action. Only 3/4 of companies overall had a public commitment to source 100% certified palm oil. Again, a basic commitment that all can take. And only 2/3 of companies committed to doing so by 2020 as their deadline. Less than half of companies declared that 100% of their palm oil purchases were certified. And in total, in the volumes of palm oil reported in the scorecard, only 58% of the 9 million tons reported declared was certified. There are some good news, though, as we have seen some progress over the years in our scorecard in the total reported volume of our SPO certified palm oil, from 29% in 2013, 39% in 2016, and now 58% in the 2020 scorecard, which I should say uses 2018 data because the calculations were done at the end of 2019. We're also seeing encouraging trends in the uptake of identity preserved and segregated crude palm oil, but challenges do remain for other types of palm. Now, briefly, how have European companies scored compared to the global average? So as you can see, overall, at the top of the slide, European companies scored a little bit higher than the global average, but only just barely, especially when it comes to actions beyond their supply chain. So there's really room for much more pronounced leadership from European companies in driving sustainability in the industry. It's also interesting to note that of the 15 companies, you can see on the left here, 15 companies leading the way, 14 of them are headquartered in Europe. But at the same time, the proportion of companies in the middle of the pack in Europe is higher than the global average. So there's a real opportunity for this group to join those leaders in driving sustainability in the industry. And we also said no company scored full marks, but some do deserve commendations, including Ferrero, Edeka, Kaufland, L'Oréal, and Kia, which you can see here as well. They're the only companies to score 19 or more out of 22 total possible points. So this is a very quick snapshot of the findings of our scorecard. We don't have the time to go through the detail of the scores here, but more information is available on the website. You've got the link at the bottom right of the corner. And there you can see more detailed findings, such as the fact that less than a third of companies globally, and even less in Europe actually, require suppliers to have a no deforestation, no conversion policy, and about the same proportion require traceability to the mill, and of course even less to the plantation. It's 10% globally and 6% in Europe. So much more ambitious and much swifter action is needed from European companies within and beyond their supply chains. So now, what are the next steps after this scorecard for us? So I'm pleased to say that we'll be releasing case studies of manufacturers and retailers later this month that will complement this data with more information on their achievements, challenges they've encountered, and solutions that would deserve to be implemented maybe at a wider scale. Be happy to speak to some of those in the Q&A if you'd like to have a bit of a preview. And we'll also be releasing a new scorecard next spring, 2021. And now finally, after the POB's scorecard results, I just wanted to briefly mention a couple of initiatives that are helping close the gap in Europe and driving progress towards sustainable palm oil at scale. And we'd love to call on more companies, perhaps sitting in the audience today, to consider joining some of these. So firstly, we've got here on the slide the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, or POTSI. It's a coalition of palm oil buyers that have put together a robust, standardized assessment of first importers of palm oil to consistently engage them and ask that they remove deforestation and exploitation across their global supply chains. And again, this is to support a transition from clean supply chains to fully clean suppliers, so they don't just sell conversion-free, exploitation-free palm oil to Europe, but continue to sell unsustainable palm oil to other markets. Another brief example, another emerging initiative is the Sustainable Palm Oil Choice, SPOC. It's a coalition of Europe-headquartered refiners and NGOs driving sustainability in palm oil supply chains broadly. And they're looking precisely at closing the gap, so identifying, connecting a lot of information available, identifying exactly where missing volumes are, taking action to address them, and secondly, also developing and amplifying communications materials around the importance of sustainable palm oil, which is very critical, especially in Europe. So these are, of course, just two examples among many. We're not short of initiatives. All of the ones featured on this slide, which is by no means, of course, comprehensive, have a really important role to play. So why are we not closing the gap in Europe? What are the missing links? So there's really room, as we said, for bolder and swifter action in all of the areas mentioned here. But perhaps one area in just the final few seconds that it feels timely to highlight is the role of policy in leveling the playing field, as we saw in the keynote speech and the initial conversations, to ensure that all businesses operate to the same high standards. It's not a silver bullet solution, but it feels like a really important piece of the puzzle today, especially critical now with the EU consultation coming up, the UK consultation, which is already live on the due diligence law. And of course, the finance sector also has a responsibility and real potential to help make sustainable palm oil the norm as well. We've seen real progress there, driven in part, by the way, by initiatives like Spot on the slide. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the next presentation now by Hans Loth from Rabobank on the finance sector perspective. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina. We do have time for one or two questions, and I already see one from the audience directed to you. How do you reflect international business non-EU traded palm oil volumes of European companies? How is that incorporated in the scorecard and your methodology?
Yeah, I think this is really very much aligned with the theory of change that is very well reflected in the mission of POTSI, one of the initiatives you mentioned, and also in the double dimension of the methodology of our scorecard. Our vision is really that we'd like companies, wherever that headquartered or wherever they operate, to make sure that they implement their commitments across their global supply chains. So of course we're talking about Europe here. We one of the criteria, so if we go back to, I can share the slides as well if it's helpful to get into more detail, but one of the things we scored is really whether or not companies require all of their suppliers to have a no deforestation, no conversion policy across their entire supply chain. So that's not just what the suppliers supply to the company, it's a requirement for their global operations. And obviously that applies to the company as well. We really want, that's part of the questions as well in the first category. We want companies to implement their commitments across their all of their entities, subsidiaries, affiliates, joint ventures, this really has to apply across the whole group and in all geographies where they operate. I think this is a really, really relevant question, a really important point here. We're not just talking about volumes that come into Europe. And a lot of these companies have activities in Southeast Asia, well, in Asia in general, and have the potential to drive a lot more change there, and also to advocate for broader industry transformation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sabrina. And we'll come back to you in the general discussion after. And people, please continue queuing in your questions in the chat box. Of course, we can't answer all of them, but we'll try to answer most of them here in the discussion. With that, Hans, I would like to hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sabrina. Let me try and show a few slides and see if you actually have visibility. Yep. Do you see them on the screen?
Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll be a little bit naughty, if I may, Dan, everybody. Obviously, the topic of today is Europe and palm oil. I do relate to Sabrina's point on the fact that this is a bit of a bigger challenge. So from a financial perspective, I'll take a global approach. And from a financial perspective, I'll also take multi-commodity perspective, because some of the challenges that we face in palm oil are not unique to palm oil, but we'll be able to paint the challenges for finance vis-a-vis food and agriculture at large. But rest assured, I'll come back to palm oil. So what is the dilemma here? In essence, going back, and I guess we all know it, we need to produce more food with less land. That is basically the food system challenge that we're up against. Again, that applies to palm oil, to soy, but to any other commodity, even obviously beyond food and agriculture. But because Rabobank is a food and agriculture bank, we focus on that part specifically. So what do we see out there? Halting the loss of more than 7 million hectares of tropical forest that disappear annually, and tackling climate change whilst growing sustainable agricultural land and to feed more people is one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. And sustainable intensification, reduction of food losses are examples of agricultural models that need a sustainable alternative. All these require turnaround investment, as also Sabrina highlighted. Farmers and food processors experience severe difficulty in accessing finance for sustainable investments. A severe funding gap and a strict regulatory framework to prevent commercial banks to finance these investments on a standalone basis exist. Required investment tenors are not available, projects are assessed as too high risk, i.e. farmer organizations are not perceived to be the best clients for commercial banks, and that all makes the cost of finance prohibitive. I realize this is not a sympathetic story, but it's the ugly world of commercial finance out there. Luckily, there are solutions, and luckily there are ways to make things better. When we look at finance, we need to realize there are various types of finance out there. There's public finance and private. And what we try to do with other organizations at Rabobank is to blend finance, where we try to catalyze public capital that is available from governments and supranational organizations and blend it with commercial finance. That you need to catalyze more private capital. Try to stay away from too much technicalities, but I hope that conceptually this makes sense. The public capital is needed to de-risk part of the private capital. And if you have a little bit of public capital from governments and the like, then private capital will flock to the investment opportunity because it feels comfortable that the first loss risk is taken care of. That's a little bit the concept. So what are the challenges here? Then we need to talk briefly about impact finance and blended finance. So blended finance, I already explained, where you blend public and private capital being from commercial banks. Impact finance is something new to commercial banks. And that is something that people may not always realize, where you not only go for financial return, which is by design what banks are about, but banks luckily flock more and more to also create impact, which is SDG impact on environment and rural livelihoods. But that's not a given for commercial banks and bankers. And that's maybe one of the challenges even that we're up against, is that we just need to get used to that particular way of working. So that's a challenge that we work through together. Another challenge is when we look at the supply chain of palm oil, we need to take a full supply chain approach. Downstream, the brands, the off-takers are often big and fairly well provided with private capital. So I'll stick to more the traders and upstream farmer level that face the most severe difficulty in finance, simply because they don't have systemic access to finance from commercial banks. And if they don't have access to finance, they cannot make that transition to more sustainable behavior. And that's what we want, and that's the topic of today in Europe and beyond. So we need that finance. So how do we do that? Ironically, it's not only the money. So first of all, we need private money, that's obvious. We need public money, that's obvious. But we also need a platform to make it work, which is technical assistance on the ground by companies like IDH to teach the farmers how to use the money. So that's an important enabler. What you also need is, when you talk about Africa and Asia and smallholders, which is then basically the type of farmers that you talk about, is that you need to cover the last mile to them. How do you reach the smallholder? Money only doesn't do the trick, because how do you even get it there, let alone monitor? So more and more, and COVID-19 even emphasized that, we see localization, we see the need for automation. So AgTech and FinTech is a key enabler to make a move. We cannot just look at governments and banks and the supply chain full stop. We really need to start working with technology. And COVID-19 really made that point really clear. So FinTech, so peer-to-peer lending, but also AgTech. How do you monitor the SDG impact of what you try to achieve? How do you onboard smallholders on global platforms, provide them access to finance, but also access to markets? Because logistics broke down for now. So you do need that online platform for farmers to, reach the traders, reach the off-takers. So those are in my list of key enablers.
Yeah.
Rounding off, looking at lessons learned and challenges, what I think we should focus on is the business case in a supply chain for food system transition. What are the choking points for a full supply chain to make that transition? What is the business case related to that? And the resulting financial ask. Those steps need to be adhered to for a useful, constructive discussion to be happening. So it's that business case that we need to focus on for all the players in the supply chain, upstream to downstream and back. And I would say a call to action also for governments to realize that their public capital is really needed to be unleashed more efficiently to the market and the private sector. So we do get that catalyzation and more funding available for that food system transition. So hopefully this paints a little bit of the picture of challenges for finance, but also solutions. So ending on a happy note, back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Hans. That's very clear, and good that you also reflect on other commodities and very much also bring in, the position at field level, right, with the farmers. And looking, because indeed, as we said, right, we need to look beyond Europe. We need to look at all the markets, and basically the transition of the entire sector and also the entire supply chain. So you rightly outline that. I'm just looking, I think we can take one question specifically for you, Hans. Let's see, there's no exact financial question here yet. But maybe for me, Hans, to understand, if we look at Europe and the gap that we still see, do you see a particular role for the financial sector in helping close that gap in terms of maybe the business case here for the off-takers in the European market?
Yes, I do, Dan. When we look at Europe, I think many important off-takers and brands are present. They do have a responsibility in their respective supply chains when they source. I also do believe that realization is kicking in more and more every day. When I touched upon the business case a few minutes before, I do believe that brands also need to look at possibilities and ways to build in a premium in pricing. For now, we are in a transition period, and we do need to make a quick change to more sustainable food production. That may require an element of premium in the pricing they set and the pricing that we see in the supermarket when we go out and buy shampoo or butter. Not to say that is a must-have for years to come, but it's something that would for sure enable also more upstream a business case, at least for a time to come. So that would give the supply chain time to organize itself and to look for other ways that are complementary and will be even more efficient than set premium to make that business case for everybody involved, because you do need a win-win-win for it to be sustainable and for it to stick. Otherwise, it's just a one-off, and that will not be enough.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Hans. Well, I think we're now opening up the floor for more general debate on what has been presented to you as an audience today. And let me pick one question for you, Hans. The question is, what sort of financial support do you think that the major players in the palm oil sector should be providing? For example, companies that are multinational, acting across the supply chain and engaging with stakeholders at every level. And maybe Sabrina, maybe you can also then, after Hans, also reflect on it, because it was also your point, right, with the question asked. You look not only at Europe, right? You look at all the operations across the globe. So Hans, first to you, and then maybe to you, Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I'll try to be brief, looking at the clock. I'll simplify matters. So what you rightfully point out is you do need a full supply chain, so nobody can sit back and relax. When we look at the downstream and the traders, which by design tend to be the bigger players, there is that realization that we need a multi-stakeholder approach. We need to do this together. So the supply chain, or even the global virtual supply chain, needs to meet the geography, needs to organize itself on the ground. And by the way, IDH is doing tremendous work in the VSA setting around that, where we look at verified sourcing areas that cater for the enablers for the supply chain to be more effective. But when you specifically look at palm oil, when you specifically look at upstream, which does have more financial needs than other parts, we do need to look at smallholders and provide them with the toolbox to behave more sustainably, because they just need the financing, they need the technical assistance, they need the technology for it to work. And that change in behavior appears to be sticky. We've been talking as an industry for maybe even decades to make that change. I do see positive steps where we really try to aggregate smallholders and help them out. But to look at that target group, who is becoming more important when you look at global food supply, is the way to go. And we do need that multi-stakeholder approach. Transactions are complex, they are cross-border. Transaction costs need to be low, so we do need to look at technology. So yeah, that would be my focus for the first step.
Yeah. Thanks, Hans. And Sabrina, your perspective?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with all that Hans has said. I think we just highlight absolutely very much a multi-stakeholder approach. I think in a lot of the solutions that we're starting to see in some of the case studies for the scorecard is that we can see supplier engagement and traceability as being a part of enabling that and enabling further cooperation across the supply chain and working closely with suppliers on some of these issues, especially for more downstream actors that feel quite far removed from the field. So there definitely is an element of that, of partnerships and collaboration towards that. And very much agree on the smallholder point. It's also something that we looked at quite closely in the scorecard and very important as we see for some companies as well. It was interesting to note as they progress towards physical volumes of certified palm oil, the part of independent smallholder credits that they used to buy to cover some of the volumes actually tends to decrease. And so that means that it really raises the question, okay, so now what else can we do to support smallholders? We can obviously buy credits on top of all certified volumes, but there's really a room for more on the ground support projects beyond, and again, we talked about a multi-stakeholder approach, but also multifaceted approach beyond just certification with projects. So yeah, fully align on these points.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe another question that I would like to take is because we also reflected on, other markets, right? I mean, we're talking about closing the gap in Europe, but that, of course, is not enough for the transition of the market and the support to the smallholders that we're currently speaking about. So one of the questions that is coming in is about, the European experience. What lessons have we learned that might help other markets like Indonesia, India, and China? Well, opening up to both of you in terms of if you have perspectives on that. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may kick off, difficult to time. Sorry, Sabrina, I'll be brief. What I do believe is that what we're experiencing in Europe is that the regulator of banks is focusing more and more on green finance and more sustainable finance, which is important. So the regulator needs to facilitate that with regulatory framework, but also that push for more sustainable finance. In a way, it's just follow the money, right? What we see actually for Indonesia, you mentioned that's quite hopeful. The regulator over there is really rounding up the banks to force, whatever verb you'd like to use, to make a change for more sustainable finance and look at their asset base. Look at their client base and look at what they do and who they finance. And I do believe that's really important, and that pressure is needed to make a change for the better. Also looking at leakage to other markets than Europe, which is really positive that's happening in Indonesia as we speak. Back to you, Sabrina.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in terms of lessons learned, there's also a clear lesson that we're all familiar with as well, that really strong and ambitious commitments were taken in 2020. We're looking at now the deadline that was initially set for 2020, and these commitments haven't been achieved. And I think a lot of that is linked to a single individual focus on specific individual supply chains. So I think one major takeaway from the past 10 years is that this is really not enough. Certification is really a key tool for market-based stakeholders. It's really important. It has such an important role to play, but it's really important to go beyond that. And as we've been saying across the presentations as well, beyond companies' own supply chains and collaborate to drive change at the pace and the scale that we need. Just focusing on individual supply chains will not suffice.
Yeah, thanks. And also a reflection from our end, also an experience from the European Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative, is that, yeah, indeed, the business case is a real driver, right? When we really supported national initiatives of the industry in the key markets in Europe, you could see that the demand was going up, right? So it's not doing it alone by doing it collectively. So I think, also the collective action in the market is important lesson learned. I know that we're running out of time. I would like to thank Hans and Sabrina very much for your presentations, everyone online for participating, for your questions. please go back to the lobby. There will be a debrief of all the other breakout sessions so that you can get the gist of what has been discussed over there. And I think in conclusion, we can say that we've made great progress in this transition, and still loads of work to do, but with a collective action across the supply chain and across markets, we will get there. So ending on a positive note, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.